Hi, I'm Rachel, a resource expert and career coach for museum educators who are stretched thin but long to fall in love with their world-changing work. After over 15 years with my own hands in the glitter, I know how it feels when your board thinks your work is childish because you work with children. I know how hard it is to lead a tour on a difficult subject, and I know the frustration of waiting on a school bus that is 20 minutes late. Or worse, 10 minutes early. As I'm heading towards the second half of my career, I find myself with the passion to help my fellow educators reverse the chronic state of being overworked and underappreciated so that they can reclaim their creativity and emotional energy. Join me and my museum buddies as we share our best tips, tricks, and techniques for modern museum education. Hello, welcome back. It is day 6 of the 12 Days of Christmas Museum Education Edition, which of course you know is my holiday gift to the museum educator community this year. So over the next few days, I'll be releasing short podcasts stuffed with actionable tips, grounded in current research, and the point of it is to help you level up your museum education programs next year quickly and efficiently. So today, day 6, we are talking about something that I find so fascinating, and I knew nothing about this, and maybe you are already on the train, but I just in the past year discovered the world of systems thinking and the concept of wicked problems. And it has really shifted the way that I think about pretty much everything in the entire world, from global issues to local issues to issues in my own household. The concept of systems thinking and wicked problems has really revolutionized the way that I just live my life. And I think that it has so much potential to inform the way that we do museum education. So I'm excited to share that with you today. Okay, so let's dive in real quickly because there's actually a lot to say on this topic and it's so interesting. My hope today is in this podcast to make a quick introduction to the idea of systems thinking in museum education, and then next year maybe to dive into some like longer form podcasts, maybe like a series where we really kind of dive into what this is, especially if it resonates with you. So if you are unfamiliar with systems thinking and wicked problems, let me just define what those terms mean. So systems thinking is a way of viewing problems as parts of a larger interconnected whole. So systems thinking is about understanding relationships and feedback loops and how changes in one part of a system ripple across an entire network. So systems thinking does originate in like a mechanical engineering world with physical and mechanical systems. But the concepts of a system can be applied as a construct to understand basically anything else in the whole entire world, because everything revolves around relationships of people to people, relationships of people to objects, relationships of people to the world, to nature, relationships of people to concepts. Like everything revolves around relationships. So systems thinking helps us understand problems that occur inside of a system because of breakdowns in relationships. And if that doesn't make sense, hopefully by the time we get to the end of this episode, you will kind of understand what I'm talking about. Now, the second term that I used, wicked problems, this is a term that I think was coined back in like the 1970s, but basically it is a term that refers to the fact that there are issues in the world that are so complex that they defy straightforward solutions. So a wicked problem is a problem that has no answer. So think about challenges like climate change or social inequity or education reform. All of these problems, they have no definitive solution because they are influenced by competing values and perspectives. And more importantly, as you work towards solving that problem, the problem itself changes and you have a new problem. So wicked problems are, don't let the term wicked throw you in the sense that it is bad in some kind of like good to bad spectrum, right? Wicked in this sense means thorny or extremely difficult, challenging, complicated. A wicked problem is just as a problem that that simply cannot ever truly be solved, because no matter how close you come to solving it, the problem itself will evolve and become a new problem. So if the idea of systems and wicked problems sound familiar, that is because museum educators often grapple with wicked problems. So whether it is addressing accessibility and creating inclusive programming, or it's building community trust, this work involves navigating complex systems. Now, in the case of museums, there's actually not a whole lot of museum-specific literature on systems thinking and solving wicked problems. You will find some references to those concepts in some literature, but there's not like a whole body of museum-centric literature on systems thinking. But there is one book. It was published in 2017 called, appropriately enough, Systems Thinking in Museums, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. That is a book that is, I'm actually still working my way through it. I've read several of the essays that are in that work. It's a great example of how systems thinking can be a benefit to us in museums. But for some reason, like so many things, there's not a systems thinking chapter specifically related to children's education in museums. There's like programming, like a generic programming section and exhibits. There's a lot on interpersonal relationships and working with communities and things of that nature. So it's a very valuable resource, but I definitely see a hole in this book that I wish was filled. Okay. So if you're interested in how systems thinking works in museums, you should definitely check this book out. It's one of the only resources out there that is specifically related to systems thinking and museums in a really accessible format. Okay, but you don't have to have a book that tells you how to do systems thinking in order to use systems thinking. Systems thinking, for me, is very intuitive, and maybe that's just because of the way that my brain works, but systems thinking is about mapping relationships between elements, whether those elements are people or their resources or their concepts. Anything can be part of a system. So I think that systems thinking can be challenging for some people, especially if they're looking for something more concrete. You really have to release your need for everything to be concrete in order to understand the concept of systems thinking. It really does rely on understanding that everything, tangible and intangible, both can be elements in a system. Now, there are a lot of different methods for approaching systems thinking, and there's two in particular that I think are helpful for me. One was a method of systems thinking that was developed by Derek Cabrera, and his method is called DSRP, and that stands for Distinctions, Systems, Relationships, and Perspectives. It's a theory and it's a method of thinking using systems thinking. So basically, he argues that those four rules, distinctions, systems, relationships, and perspectives, are the foundation for all systems thinking models. So if you're looking for a good place to start with systems thinking, you might check out Cabrera and Cabrera's book. Basically, in the book, the authors suggest that everything in a system, every piece of information, every element, tangible and intangible, must be distinguished from other pieces. It either contains other pieces or it itself is contained by other pieces. So it's all part inside the system. So it's part of the system. It's a smaller part of the whole, or it's a bigger part of the whole, but it is part of the whole. Everything is related to everything else. So maybe not directly, but everything can be mapped. You can have a relationship map of every element in a system to every other element in a system. And everything in the system has to be viewed from the perspective of another piece of information. So this is where you're talking about perspectives. And I think that the concept of perspectives is where systems thinking just really shines in museum work. So I know that this is kind of esoteric. So let me give you a real world example. Okay. Let's apply this concept of systems thinking to the wicked problems that is museum programming fees. Should you charge admission fees for your programs? So we're going to use this kind of big concept model to address something that all of us have to deal with on the regular. We have to decide, are we going to put up a financial barrier between our program, between our information, between our heritage, art, culture, and science, and the public? This is a really thorny question because there's a lot of reasons why you should not do that, accessibility being the main one. However, there are a lot of reasons why you should charge admission fees. Not insignificantly, your museum has to have operating funds. Operating funds are not often covered by grant money, and so if there are no operating funds, you cannot get paid, and your museum cannot pay you a living wage. They cannot pay their interns if they don't have operating funds. And operating funds can, of course, come from private donations, but private donations come with strings attached. I mentioned this in an earlier episode of this series, but remember the Sackler controversy where a number of high-profile museums had to reckon with their acceptance of large donations from a family whose name was then embroiled in a terrible scandal. And so private donations, just like public funds, come with strings attached, just like admission fees come with strings attached. This is a wicked problem. Okay, so another reason why applying systems thinking to solving museum problems is beneficial is because some of the key principles of critical systems thinking are critical awareness and pluralism and improvement. And those concepts really marry well with the work that we do in museums because, contemporary museum programming focuses on the importance of inclusivity and justice and a pluralistic understanding of culture. And this just dovetails really nicely with systems thinking because systems thinking honors the perspective of every piece of information in the system. Okay, so there is another method for systems thinking that really resonates with me because I like the simplistic nature of it, and it's easy for me to remember it. It's called the EPIC model of systems thinking, and the first stage, the E, stands for exploration. So in the EPIC model, just like in most other systems thinking models, you start by taking the time to consult all stakeholders and all key contributors. You're looking for the perspective of every piece of information inside of a system. So you would be looking at the families who participate in the programs that you may or may not be charging admission for. You're looking at the other museum visitors. You're looking at the perspective of your board, the perspective of your volunteers, the perspective of your staff, the perspective of your education staff, the perspective of your curatorial staff, the perspective of your registration staff, the perspective of your facilities staff, the perspective of your support services like your gift shop or your restaurant. You're looking at all of their perspectives as well onto this issue because all of them have something to say about whether or not you charge admission fees because it will impact them. For example, no admission fees might mean higher visitation. Higher visitation means more bathrooms that have to be cleaned more frequently. Higher visitation means that your restaurant or your gift shop might need more staff. So do you see how all of these things are connected? So even though you might be thinking, I want to remove this financial barrier for a certain demographic of our audience, but people that you work with may be seeing that decision and saying, okay, I get that it's accessible, but also you are making my life very difficult and maybe making my job impossible. So there are a lot of perspectives involved. And it doesn't mean that a solution cannot be found. It just means that a perfect solution cannot be found. And that is why there's so much value in recognizing the perspective of every single stakeholder involved in any issue. So then the next stage is to actually produce a model. So once you have all of this information, you've mapped out how all of the pieces in the system, how all the perspectives in the system relate to each other and how they all impact each other, then your next step is to produce some kind of solution. And again, a wicked problem is never going to have a perfect solution. So you're really just producing an action model where you essentially make a choice that is appropriate for the problem at hand to the best of your ability. So you're making the best choice you can with the information that you have in this moment. recognizing that this moment will not be the next moment, and that recognizing that you may have more information later, and recognizing that you might be able to make a better decision further on down the road, but you're going to make a decision and you're going to take action. The last two stages of the EPIC model are to intervene and check. And these two stages basically represent the part of the system where you iterate, where you intervene in the system, where you're checking to see, how is this going? You're looking for feedback loops. Are things falling apart? And you're trying to identify where in the system things are breaking down. So if you have, for example, reduced your admission fees or eliminated them for a particular program, then you're looking for, how did that actually impact? Did you actually see an increase in visitation? Did you actually see an increase in damage to your site? You're looking for places where in the system you can intervene to tweak, and you're going to make small changes, adjusting as you go. The thing about systems thinking is that you're never going to find the singular perfect solution. It's always going to be a work in progress. And I think that, I think that can be frustrating for some people, but I also think there's so much beauty in having the mindset that everything is constantly a work in progress. Everything is constantly being improved. And that just, for me, it gives so much freedom to try new things, freedom to experiment, freedom to listen to everyone's perspectives, freedom to invite perspectives without judgment. And it's freedom to think of the work that we do as a cycle and not a linear process that has a final end. Thinking about our work in museums as something that is constantly ongoing, constantly adapting, constantly evolving, constantly improving, allows us to have so much freedom to experiment and to try, and you're never going to know what really works or what really doesn't work until you try it. And having a systems thinking mindset opens the door for that exploration. But it opens the door for exploration that is grounded in the perspective of every single stakeholder. And I think that for me is where the real value of systems thinking meets the value of museums. So I really want to encourage you just to embrace the idea of systems thinking. I really believe that it can help us solve some of the complex challenges that we face in museum education with great insight and greater impact. So if this has been interesting to you, I'm going to put the links to two books in the show notes. One is Systems Thinking in Museums. It was published in 2017. And the second one is Exploring Wicked Problems, what they are and why they are important. And this was my introductory book to the concept of wicked problems. I found it to be very approachable and really inspiring as well. So I'm going to put links to those two books as well. Oh, and also I'll put a link to the Cabrera and Cabrera book that I mentioned, that is the DSRP model of systems thinking, which is, I read it for one of my classes, and like half of our cohort found it to be really accessible, and the other half of our cohort found it to be really confusing. So I don't know whether that one will be super helpful to you or not, but you might check that out if you're interested. But I would definitely encourage you to maybe think about how you can embrace wicked problems and systems thinking to solve wicked problems in your museum education programs next year. So, okay, that's all for today. I'm going to wrap this up, and I will see you back tomorrow for day 7 of the 12 Days of Christmas. Thank you so much for joining us. If this episode has been helpful to you or interesting, please take a minute to like, subscribe, and leave a review, which will help other museum educators find this resource. As always, if you would like to work with me more directly, have any questions, or would like to be a guest on the podcast, you can find links to all that and more on my website, modernmuseumeducation.com. I'll see you back here next time, and in the meantime, please remember that your work is not childish just because you work with children.